Chapter 3, Book 1 of Rookwood. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Paul Curran. Rookwood by William Harrison Ainsworth. Book 1, Chapter 3, The Park. Brian. Ralph, hearest thou any stirring? Ralph. I heard one speak here, hard by, in the hollow. Peace, master, speak low. Nouns, if I do not hear a bow go off, and the buck bray, I never heard deer in my life. Brian. Stand, or I'll shoot. Sir Arthur. Who's there? Brian. I am the keeper, and do charge you stand. You have stolen my deer. Merry Devil of Edmonton. Luke's first impulse had been to free himself from the restraint imposed by his grandsire's society. He longed to commune with himself. Leaping the small boundary wall, which defended the churchyard from a deep green lane, he hurried along in a direction contrary to that taken by the sexton, making the best of his way until he arrived at a gap in the high banked hazel hedge which overhung the road. Heedless of the impediments thrown in his way by the undergrowth of a rough ring fence, he struck through the opening that presented itself, and climbing over the moss-grown paling, trod presently upon the elastic sward of Rookwood Park. A few minutes' rapid walking brought him to the summit of a rising ground crowned with aged oaks, and, as he passed beneath their broad shadows, his troubled spirit, soothed by the quietude of the scene, in part resumed its serenity. Luke yielded to the gentle influence of the time and hour. The stillness of the spot allayed the irritation of his frame, and the dewy chillness cooled the fever of his brow. Leaning for support against the gnarled trunk of one of the trees, he gave himself up to contemplation. The events of the last hour of his whole existence passed in rapid review before him. The thought of the wayward vagabond life he had led, of the wild adventures of his youth, of all that he had been, of all that he had done, of all he had endured, crowded his mind, and then, like the passing of a cloud flitting across the autumnal moon, and occasionally obscuring the smiling landscape before him, his soul was shadowed by the remembrance of the awful revelations of the last hour, and the fearful knowledge he had acquired of his mother's fate, of his father's guilt. The eminence on which he stood was one of the highest points of the park, and commanded a view of the hall, which might be a quarter of a mile distant, discernible through a broken vista of trees, its whitened walls glimmering in the moonlight, and its tall chimney spiring far from out the round masses of the wood in which it lay embosomed. The ground gradually sloped in that direction, occasionally rising into swells, studded with magnificent timber, dipping into smooth dells, or stretching out into level glades, until it suddenly sank into a deep declivity that formed an effectual division, without the intervention of a haw-haw or other barrier, between the chase and the home park. A slender stream strayed through this ravine, having found its way thither from a small reservoir, hidden in the higher plantations to the left, and further on in the open ground, and in a line with the hall, though, of course, much below the level of the building, assisted by many local springs, and restrained by a variety of natural and artificial embankments, this brook spread out into an expansive sheet of water. Crossed by a rustic bridge, the only communication between the parks, the pool found its outlet into the meads below, and even at that distance, and at that still hour, you might almost catch the sound of the brawling waters as they dashed down the weir in a foaming cascade; while far away, in the spreading valley, the serpentine meanderings of the slender current might be traced, glittering like silvery threads in the moonshine. The mild beams of the Queen of Night, then in her meridian, trembled upon the topmost branches of the tall timber, quivering like diamond spray upon the outer foliage, and penetrating through the interstices of the trees, fell upon the light wreaths of vapour then beginning to rise from the surface of the pool, steeping them in misty splendour, and lending to this part of the picture a character of dreamy and unearthly beauty. All else was in unison. No sound interrupted the silence of Luke's solitude, except the hooting of a large grey owl, that, scared at his approach, or in search of prey, winged its spectral flight in continuous and mazy circles round his head, uttering at each wheel its startling whoop, or a deep distant bay that ever and anon boomed upon the ear, proceeding from a pack of hounds kennelled in a shed adjoining the pool before mentioned, but which was shrouded from view by the rising mist. No living objects presented themselves, save a herd of deer, crouched in a covert of brown fern beneath the shadow of a few stunted trees, immediately below the point of land on which Luke stood, and although their branching antlers could scarcely be detected from the ramifications of the wood itself, they escaped not his practised ken. "How often," murmured Luke, "in years gone by, have I traversed these moonlit glades, and wandered amid these woodlands on nights as heavenly as this. Ay, and to some purpose, as yon thinned herd might testify. Every dingle, every dell, every rising brow, every bosky vale and shelving covert, have been as familiar to my track as to that of the fleetest and freest of their number. Scarce a tree amidst the thickest of yon outstretching forests with which I cannot claim acquaintance. 'Tis long since I have seen them, by heavens, 'tis beautiful, and is all my own. Can I forget that it was here I first emancipated myself from thraldom? Can I forget the boundless feeling of delight that danced within my veins when I first threw off the yoke of servitude, and roved, unshackled, unrestrained, amidst these woods? The wild, intoxicating bliss still tingles to my heart, and they are all my own, my own." Softly, what have we there? Luke's attention was arrested by an object which could not fail to interest him, sportsman as he was. A snorting bray was heard, and a lordly stag stalked slowly and majestically from out the copse. Luke watched the actions of the noble animal with great interest, drawing back into the shade. 100 yards or thereabouts might be between him and the buck. It was within range of ball. Luke mechanically grasped his gun, yet his hand had scarcely raised the piece halfway to his shoulder when he dropped it again to its rest. "What am I about to do?" he mentally ejaculated. "Why, for mere pastime, should I take away yon noble creature's life, when his carcass would be utterly useless to me? Yet such is the force of habit, that I can scarce resist the impulse that tempted me to fire. And I have known the time, and that not long since, when I should have shown no such self-control." Unconscious of the danger it had escaped, the animal moved forward with the same stately step. Suddenly it stopped, with ears pricked, as if some sound had smote them. At that instant the click of a gunlock was heard at a little distance to the right. The piece had missed fire. An instantaneous report from another gun succeeded, and, with a bound high in the air, the buck fell upon his back, struggling in the agonies of death. Luke had at once divined the cause. He was aware that poachers were at hand. He fancied that he knew the parties, nor was he deceived in his conjecture. 2 figures issued instantly from a covert on the right, and making to the spot, the first who reached it put an end to the animal's struggles by plunging a knife into its throat. The affrighted herd took to their heels, and were seen darting swiftly down the chase. One of the twain, meantime, was occupied in feeling for the deer's fat, when he was approached by the other, who pointed in the direction of the house. The former raised himself from his kneeling posture, and both appeared to listen attentively. Luke fancied he heard a slight sound in the distance. Whatever the noise proceeded from, it was evident that the deer stealers were alarmed. They laid hold of the buck, and, dragging it along, concealed the carcass among the tall fern. They then retreated, halting for an instant to deliberate within a few yards of Luke, who was concealed from their view by the trunk of the tree behind which he had ensconced his person. They were so near that he lost not a word of their muttered conference. "The game's spoiled this time, Rob Rust, anyhow,"